This remark was not calculated to make Edward or Elinor more easy, nor to conciliate the goodwill of Lucy, who looked up at Marianne with no very benign expression. "Do you like London?" said Edward, willing to say anything that might introduce another subject. "Not at all. I expected much pleasure in it, but I have found none. The sight of you, Edward, is the only comfort it has afforded. We spent such a day, Edward, in Harley Street yesterday. So dull, so wretchedly dull. But why were you not there, Edward? Why did you not come?" "I was engaged elsewhere." "Engaged? But what was that when there were such friends to be met?" "Perhaps, Miss Marianne," cried Lucy, "you think young men never stand upon engagements." Elinor was very angry, but Marianne calmly replied, "I am sure that conscience only kept Edward from Harley Street. He is the most incapable of being selfish of anybody I ever saw. Edward, it is so, and I will say it." "What? Are you never to hear yourself praised? Then you must be no friend of mine, for those who will accept of my love and esteem must submit to my open commendation." The nature of her commendation in the present case, however, happened to be particularly ill-suited to the feelings of 2/3 of her auditors, and Edward very soon got up to go away. "Going so soon?" said Marianne. "My dear Edward, this must not be." And drawing him a little aside, she whispered that Lucy could not stay much longer. But even this encouragement failed, for he would go, and Lucy, who would have outstayed him had his visit lasted 2 hours, soon afterwards went away. I come now to the relation of a misfortune, which about this time befell upon Mrs. John Dashwood. It so happened that while her 2 sisters were with Mrs. Jennings calling on her in Harley Street, another of her acquaintance, Mrs. Denison, had dropped in. On merely hearing the name of the Miss Dashwoods, and understanding them to be Mr. Dashwood's sisters, she immediately concluded them to be staying in Harley Street. And this misconstruction produced within a day or 2 cards of invitation for them, as well as their brother and sister, to a small musical party at her house. The consequence of which was that Mrs. John Dashwood was obliged to send her carriage for the Miss Dashwoods, and what was worse, treat them with attention. The events of the evening were not very remarkable. As Elinor was neither musical nor affecting to be so, she made no scruple of turning away her eyes from the grand pianoforte whenever it suited her. In one of these excursive glances, she perceived a young man speaking familiarly to her brother. They both came towards her, and Mr. Dashwood introduced him to her as Mr. Robert Ferrars. He addressed her with easy civility, and twisted his head into a bow which assured her that he was exactly the coxcomb she had heard him described to be by Lucy. Happy had it been for her if her regard for Edward had depended less on his own merits than on the merit of his nearest relations. But while she wondered at the difference of the 2 young men, she did not find that the emptiness and conceit of the one put her at all out of charity with the modesty and worth of the other.
"You reside in Devonshire, I think," he said, "in a cottage near Dawlish?"
Elinor set him right as to its situation, and it seemed rather surprising to him that anybody could live in Devonshire without living near Dawlish. He bestowed his hearty approbation, however, on their species of house.
"For my part," said he, "I am excessively fond of a cottage. There is always so much more comfort, so much elegance about them. If people do but know how to set about it, every comfort may be as well enjoyed in a cottage as in the most spacious dwelling."
Elinor agreed to it all, for she did not think he deserved the compliment of rational opposition. As John Dashwood had no more pleasure in music than his eldest sister, his mind was equally at liberty to fix on anything else, and the consideration of Mrs. Denison's mistake in supposing his sisters their guests had suggested the propriety of their being invited to become such while Mrs. Jennings was away from home. Fanny was startled at the proposal.
"I do not see how it can be done," said she, "without affronting Lady Middleton. They are Lady Middleton's visitors. How can I ask them away from her.
Her husband, but with great humility, did not see the force of her objection. Fanny paused a moment, and then with fresh vigour said,
My love, I would ask them with all my heart if it was in my power, but I had just settled within myself to ask the Miss Steeles to spend a few days with us. We can ask your sister some other year, you know.
Mr. Dashwood was convinced. He saw the necessity of inviting the Miss Steeles immediately, and his conscience was pacified by the resolution of inviting his sisters another year. Fanny, rejoicing in her escape, wrote the next morning to Lucy to request her company and her sisters for some days in Harley Street as soon as Lady Middleton could spare them. This was enough to make Lucy reasonably happy. Such an opportunity of being with Edward and his family was, above all things, the most material to her interest, and such an invitation the most gratifying to her feelings. When the note was shown to Elinor, as it was within 10 minutes after its arrival, it gave her, for the first time, some share in the expectations of Lucy. For such a mark of uncommon kindness, vouchsafed on so short an acquaintance, seemed to declare that the goodwill towards her arose from something more than merely malice against herself, and might be brought, by time and address, to do everything that Lucy wished. The Miss Steeles removed to Harley Street, and Sir John, who called on them more than once, brought home such accounts of the favour that they were in as must be universally striking.